My wife was cheating on me in our bedroom while I was under hypnosis. I never thought I'd be that guy telling a story like this, but here I am. My wife cheated on me while I sat right there in the room, and somehow, I don't remember a thing. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened, and it's still messing with my head. For most of our marriage, Kelly and I were the kind of couple people envied. We'd met in college, married young, and built a life that felt like the dream. She's gorgeous, funny, and always had this magnetic energy that pulled people in. Our friends would always say how lucky I was, and I'd laugh it off, knowing it was true. Life wasn't perfect, no marriage is, but it felt solid. Until it didn't. It started subtly, like a whisper in the background of our lives. Kelly became interested in alternative therapies and self-improvement courses. She'd always been into yoga and meditation, so I didn't think much of it when she started going to weekend retreats or talking about energy alignment and spiritual healing. It sounded harmless. Weird, maybe, but harmless. Then she suggested I join her. At first, I resisted. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in crystals or chants under the moonlight, but she said it could help me with my insomnia and stress. It's worth a try, she'd said with that smile of hers. And because I trusted her, because I loved her, I gave in. That's how James entered our lives. James was a hypnotherapist. Kelly found him through some friend of a friend recommendation and raved about how amazing he was. When she brought him home for the first session, I didn't know what to expect. He wasn't what I pictured. Younger than I thought, maybe mid-30s, with a confident, almost smug aura. He had one of those smooth voices that made you want to believe everything he said. The first session was strange but uneventful. He asked me a bunch of questions about my stress levels, sleep patterns, and general well-being. Then he guided me through a relaxation exercise. I remember closing my eyes, listening to his voice, and feeling an odd sense of calm wash over me. When I woke up, he was packing up his things, and Kelly was smiling like everything went perfectly. "How do you feel?" she asked, her tone unusually bright. "Fine," I said, and I did feel fine, maybe even a little lighter. I thought, okay, maybe this isn't total nonsense, but something about James bothered me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The next few sessions followed the same pattern. James would come over, guide me into a trance, and I'd wake up feeling blank. Not refreshed, not drained, just blank. Like time had skipped forward without my consent. Each time, Kelly seemed more enthusiastic about the whole process. She'd linger in the room during the sessions, watching with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I chalked it up to her wanting to make sure it was helping me. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. Little inconsistencies. I'd wake up from a session and find objects in the room slightly out of place. Kelly's behavior shifted, too. She'd get these secretive smiles and disappear for hours at a time, saying she was running errands or meeting friends. When I asked for details, she'd deflect with vague answers. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around, was now glued to her hand. One night, I woke up at 2 a.m. and found her in the kitchen, texting someone. When she saw me, she jumped like a kid caught sneaking cookies before dinner. She claimed it was work-related, but the way she clutched her phone made me doubt it. It was like a wall had sprung up between us, one I couldn't see over or through. The real kicker was the dreams. After one of the sessions, I started having these fragmented, hazy dreams. They weren't like my usual dreams, though. In these, I'd be in our living room, watching Kelly and James talk in hushed tones. Sometimes they'd look at me, then at each other, with expressions I couldn't interpret. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding, but when I tried to piece it together, it slipped away like smoke through my fingers. It all felt too strange to ignore. Something was happening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one not in on the secret. The more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. Why did Kelly insist on James? Why did she act so differently after the sessions? And why couldn't I remember what happened while I was under? The tension in our house grew thicker with each passing day. Kelly and I started arguing more, though I couldn't pinpoint what we were even fighting about. It was like the foundation of our marriage was cracking, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it. Every time I tried to bring up my concerns, she'd shut me down, insisting I was overthinking. But I wasn't. I knew something was wrong. The last session with James was the worst. I remember sitting in the chair, his voice washing over me, feeling the usual fog creep in. But this time, when I woke up, Kelly and James were standing closer than I'd ever seen them. She was leaning toward him, her hand brushing his arm, and when they noticed I was awake, they jumped apart like guilty teenagers. "How was it?" she asked, her voice overly cheerful. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of panic she couldn't hide. That's when I knew. Whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. Kelly was keeping something from me, and James was in on it. I just didn't know what it was yet, but I was going to find out. The feeling of unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing day. I couldn't shake the images of Kelly and James standing so close, the way their voices dropped when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The tension had reached a point where I knew I couldn't just sit back anymore. I had to know what was happening during those sessions, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. If no one would tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I ordered a small, discreet camera online, the kind that could easily blend into the background without drawing attention. When it arrived, I carefully set it up in the living room, positioning it perfectly to capture the couch where I usually sat during my sessions. The plan was simple: record everything and watch the footage later. Part of me felt guilty for invading Kelly's privacy like this, but the stronger part reminded me that something was very wrong, and I had a right to the truth. The next session came around quickly. James arrived, his usual confident self, and Kelly greeted him with that same overly bright smile. As they settled into the routine, I tried to keep my breathing steady, focusing on acting normal. James's voice slipped into that familiar, hypnotic tone, and soon enough, I was out. When I woke up, everything seemed ordinary. James packed up his things, Kelly kissed me on the cheek, and the day moved on like it always did. But this time, I had something different: the recording. I waited until Kelly left the house before pulling out my laptop and watching the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The session started normally enough. James guided me into a trance, his voice smooth and deliberate. But then things took a turn I hadn't anticipated. Once he was sure I was fully under, James leaned back, his demeanor shifting from professional to something far more personal. Kelly moved closer to him, sitting on the armrest of the couch, her hand casually resting on his shoulder. I watched in stunned silence as they spoke in hushed tones, their words barely audible over the recording. Then, James gave me a direct command: to remain calm and stay deeply relaxed no matter what. My body didn't so much as twitch on the screen. I looked completely out of it, like a puppet with its strings cut. The footage only got worse. After ensuring I wouldn't wake, they stopped pretending to keep their distance. Kelly's hand slid down James's arm, and he pulled her closer. My living room, the space where we'd built our life together, had become their private stage for betrayal. Their movements became bolder, their laughter more intimate. At one point, they even left the room, heading toward the bedroom. The faint sound of muffled voices and laughter trailed back, and although the camera couldn't follow them, the implications were impossible to ignore. By the time they returned to the living room, their demeanor had shifted. They acted as though nothing had happened, straightening their clothes and arranging the room back to its original state. James then came over to me, checking my pulse and giving me another command to wake up gradually when he snapped his fingers. The session ended just like any other, leaving me none the wiser. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling with rage and disbelief. The truth stared back at me, undeniable and brutal. Kelly, the woman I had trusted with everything, had used my vulnerability against me. And James? He wasn't just a manipulator. He was a predator, exploiting his position and my trust to tear apart my life. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Confronting them outright felt impossible. They didn't know I had seen the footage, and that was my only advantage. If I stormed in and demanded answers, they'd deny everything or twist the narrative to make me look like the bad guy. No, I needed a plan, a way to expose them both without giving them the chance to wriggle out of it. I spent the rest of the day pretending everything was fine. When Kelly came home, I smiled, kissed her, and asked about her day like nothing had changed. Inside, though, I was barely holding it together. Every time she laughed or touched me, it felt like a cruel joke. But I knew I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me. Not yet. That night, lying next to her in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the footage in my mind. The betrayal, the audacity, the sheer disrespect, it all hit me in waves. But the worst part wasn't even the cheating itself. It was the fact that they had done it right in front of me, counting on my helplessness to shield them from consequences. As the hours dragged on, a plan began to take shape in my mind. I'd gather more evidence, make sure there was no room for doubt. Then, when the time was right, I'd confront them both in a way they'd never see coming. They thought they had all the control, but they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. This wasn't just about exposing their lies. It was about taking back my power. And as I looked over at Kelly, still peacefully asleep, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. She had no idea what was coming. By the time the next session rolled around, I had a plan. I wasn't going to let Kelly or James suspect anything. If they wanted to play their twisted games, I'd beat them at it. I pretended everything was fine, but inside, I was seething. The first step was simple but crucial. I remembered something James had mentioned during one of the early sessions. To avoid caffeine before hypnosis, as it could interfere with relaxation. That little detail stuck in my mind, and now it felt like a weapon. An hour before the session, I brewed the strongest coffee I could, downing 2 cups in quick succession. My heart raced, but I didn't care. I needed to stay alert. When James arrived, everything felt like clockwork. He walked in with his usual smug confidence, while Kelly fluttered around, making small talk and laughing at his jokes. My stomach churned with disgust, but I kept my face neutral. If they noticed anything off, they didn't show it. As the session began, I took my usual spot on the couch, feigning relaxation. James's voice droned on, his words carefully calibrated to lull me into a trance. But this time, I fought it. My mind stayed sharp, my body tense beneath the surface. Every muscle screamed at me to stay still, to play the part. I needed them to believe I was under. Minutes passed, and then it happened. James leaned back in his chair, signaling to Kelly that I was out. My eyes stayed closed, but my ears strained to catch every word. Their voices dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, and I felt the familiar anger bubbling up again. I kept my breathing steady, waiting for the right moment. They started talking openly, like I wasn't even there. James chuckled, calling me an easy mark, while Kelly laughed along, her tone light but tinged with something cruel. They joked about how oblivious I was, how easy it had been to carry on their affair right under my nose. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, but I stayed still. Kelly leaned in, her voice dropping even lower. She said she felt alive for the first time in years, and that being with James was exciting in a way I could never match. My chest tightened at her words, but I refused to let it show. James responded with the same cocky assurance, promising her that this was just the beginning of their new chapter. The audacity of it all was almost unbearable. Finally, I'd heard enough. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up straight, startling them both. Kelly's face went pale, while James froze mid-sentence. I pulled out my phone, the recording app running, and held it up for them to see. The look on their faces was worth every second of the torment they'd put me through. James tried to regain his composure, stammering about how this was all a misunderstanding and part of the therapy process. He claimed it was meant to help me release my inhibitions or some nonsense like that. But his words rang hollow, and he knew it. I let him talk himself into a corner before cutting him off. I played back a snippet of their conversation, their voices crystal clear. Kelly's gasp was audible as the reality of the situation hit her. James looked like he'd been punched in the gut. There was no denying what they'd done. And for once, they were out of excuses. Kelly broke down first. She started crying, saying it wasn't what it looked like, that she'd gotten caught up in something she didn't know how to stop. She claimed she still loved me, that she wanted to fix things. But her words felt hollow, like they were more about saving face than genuine remorse. James, on the other hand, doubled down. He tried to shift the blame onto me, saying I neglected Kelly and left her vulnerable to his harm. The sheer arrogance of it made me laugh, a bitter sound that seemed to rattle him. I told him he could save his justifications, because I'd already made up my mind about both of them. Turning to Kelly, I laid it out plain and simple. This wasn't over. She and James had betrayed me in the worst way, and there would be consequences. I didn't yell or scream. My voice was calm, even cold. I think that scared her more than anything. James tried to intervene, but I shut him down with a glare. He wasn't worth the energy it would take to argue. Instead, I stood up, looked them both in the eyes, and told them this was only the beginning. I had no intention of letting them off the hook easily. Whatever came next, they'd brought it on themselves. I stood up, looked them both in the eyes, and told them to get out of my house. Kelly stared at me in shock, while James hesitated, trying to say something, but I cut him off with a sharp motion. They had no place here anymore, not after what they'd done. As they gathered their things and left, the weight on my chest lifted slightly. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control again. This was far from over, and I was ready for whatever came next. After they walked out of my house, the weight of betrayal was replaced with cold determination. I knew what I had to do. Filing for divorce was the obvious first step, but that wasn't enough. Kelly and James had trampled over my trust, my life, and my dignity, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They thought they could rewrite the narrative, but this time, I'd be the one holding the pen. The recordings were my leverage, but I needed to wield them carefully. I began by consulting a lawyer. After laying out the situation and sharing the evidence, she confirmed that the recordings were not only damning, but also perfectly legal to use. She assured me that they would strengthen my case in the divorce proceedings, especially since they highlighted the manipulative and unethical behavior of both Kelly and James. However, the legal side of things was only part of my plan. I uploaded the recordings to a secure drive and began editing snippets to blur any personal identifiers, leaving only the incriminating conversations. My goal wasn't just to expose their betrayal, but to reveal James for what he truly was, a manipulator who had likely done this before. Social media became my weapon of choice. I created an anonymous account and posted the clips with a simple caption, "Beware of the man who calls himself a healer." The response was overwhelming. Within hours, the post started gaining traction. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to support. People shared their own horror stories of dealing with so-called therapists who abused their positions of power. A few even recognized James and claimed to have had similar experiences with him. It became clear that he wasn't just a one-time offender. He had a pattern. As the post went viral, James's professional reputation began to crumble. Clients started canceling appointments, and local news outlets picked up the story. I watched with grim satisfaction as his facade unraveled. He issued a weak statement trying to deny the allegations, but the evidence was too compelling. More victims came forward, and soon he had no choice but to step down from his practice. The career he had built on lies and manipulation was effectively over. Meanwhile, Kelly's life took a downward spiral of its own. Word spread among our friends and family about what she had done, and the fallout was swift. Invitations dried up, and the supportive circle she had once relied on began to shrink. I didn't revel in her misery, But I couldn't ignore the poetic justice of it all. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth, given the circumstances. Kelly didn't contest anything. I think part of her knew she had no leg to stand on. The house, the savings, and even the car were awarded to me. She walked away with little more than the clothes on her back and a stark reminder of what she had lost. For weeks after, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and anger all swirled together. But there was also a growing sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the weight of mistrust and manipulation pressing down on me. I started focusing on rebuilding my life, one step at a time. Therapy became a part of my routine, real therapy, with a licensed professional who helped me unpack the trauma of what had happened. I leaned on friends and family, finding comfort in their unwavering support. Slowly but surely, I began to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. The final act of my plan came when I shared my story publicly, not through anonymous posts or viral videos, but in my own words. I wanted people to know what had happened, not for sympathy, but as a cautionary tale. Betrayal can come from the people you trust most, but so can resilience and strength. My story became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a way forward. Kelly never tried to reach out, and I was fine with that. James disappeared from the public eye, his reputation in shambles. And me? I moved on. I sold the house, traveled for a while, and eventually settled into a new city with a fresh start. The scars of what happened would always be there, but they no longer define me. Looking back, the betrayal taught me lessons I hadn't expected to learn. Trust is fragile. Manipulation is insidious, and healing takes time. But most importantly, I learned that letting go isn't the same as giving up. It's reclaiming your power and deciding how your story ends. For me, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I finally got to write the narrative on my terms.